My simple and straightforward amendment says that none of the funds can be used to conduct civil immigration enforcement actions at shelters for women who experience domestic violence. One of the very first actions that the Trump administration took was to cancel a policy that had been put in place in 2011, so it's been in existence for 14 years, that prohibits ICE from conducting enforcement actions in domestic violence shelters. That policy stated, this is a quote, that particular care should be used with any organization assisting victims of crime or abuse. Ending protections for people trying to escape domestic violence only empowers abusers. And I can't imagine that my colleagues across the aisle want to encourage abusers. Trump's lack of enforcement priorities and attacks on all immigrant communities is having a devastating impact. And specifically, if you look at domestic violence organizations that I've been involved with for a very long time, during the first term in office, during Trump's first term in office, organizations working with domestic violence survivors reported that nearly 80% of immigrant victims were scared to report their abuse to the police. Workers at domestic violence shelters reported traumatized women afraid to come forward out of fear that they would be separated from their children or deported. And they also reported that women were no longer coming to the shelter after the first or the second incident of domestic violence, and instead they would only come to the shelter after they were so severely beaten that they were running for their lives. Now we're starting to see the same pattern emerge again, except this time it's even worse. The Trump administration gutted the Division of Violence Prevention at the CDC and placed the head of HHS's Office of Family Violence Prevention and Services on leave. Those are two offices within our government that work to prevent domestic violence. Funding for nonprofits that help support survivors of domestic violence has been frozen while the administration evaluates if their mission, quote, aligns with the president's agenda. So I guess if you're working on domestic violence prevention, somehow you don't align with the president's agenda. My question is, does it align with the agenda of those across the aisle that are sitting here tonight? Is it okay to have domestic violence victims not be able to report their abuse and to be beaten severely? It is incredibly disturbing to think about what is happening to our survivors of violence. In addition to Trump's broader attacks on the support network for survivors of domestic violence, the administration has also gone after immigrant survivors. There are several of the thousands of students who had their visas canceled by the administration that were survivors of domestic violence. One in particular, she and her partner were both arrested after he assaulted her. This is a common occurrence in domestic violence situations. And as the victim, she wasn't charged with a crime, but because of that interaction with the police, ICE arbitrarily canceled her visa. These are the very stories that empower abusers. There's a much older case that I wanted to call your attention to. An abuser called ICE to go after his victim who was hiding at a domestic violence shelter. And after the local police chief called the shelter director to explain that ICE just wanted to ask the victim questions, the shelter director allowed ICE agents to enter. And ICE immediately then arrested the victim and put her in removal proceedings. So in the midst of all of everything that's happening tonight, I want to bring into the room the survivors of domestic assault, domestic violence that are absolutely terrified. And I want to ask each of you to think about what that might mean for a survivor of domestic violence, to know that prosecutors are now reporting that women who had been cooperating with them to bring cases against their abusive spouses have now gone silent because nobody on that side of the aisle is speaking up to say we need to protect victims and survivors of domestic violence. Nobody is speaking up for these women who are so terrified that if they go out and confront their abusers that they are going to be deported. And that just makes it impossible for law enforcement to gain the trust of victims, and it allows violence against women to proliferate and make our communities less safe. So this is a sensible, sane, simple amendment. I say that with no joke at all. It is actually pretty simple to stand up for victims of domestic violence. And so I'm asking for your support for this amendment to ensure that ICE cannot go in and raid domestic violence shelters. I yield back.